Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture 10 of week 2. This is Dripta and the topic for today's class is the faculty of language. I hope you remembered that we already started talking about the faculty of language in the previous class, and now you have some idea about the concept of the faculty of language. So, in this class we will be covering the points that you can see on the slides. The nature of human faculty of language, I mean what do we mean by faculty of language in little detail. Also how the evolution questions are related to the faculty of language. I hope you remember we talked about two different types of the faculty of language, FLB and FLN, faculty of language in the broad sense and narrow sense. We will come back to these concepts in today's class and we will be talking about the difference between these two concepts. We will be also learning about two interfaces which are very important notions in relation to the faculty of language. And as this is the last lecture of week 2, we are also wrapping up the basic theoretical ideas related to the knowledge of language, and I am sure now you can figure out that you have learnt about certain concepts which are related to the basic notion of the knowledge of language. So, this is a class where you can brush up your learning, and we will be coming back to the some parts of the lessons that we had already learned previously. So, in that sense it is also a summing up class for week 1 and 2. So, coming back to the idea of faculty of language, we will be mentioning certain important ideas which we have learned previously. So, for example, human faculty of language appears to be originated like the genetic code. You remember we talked about the genetic endowment of human beings in terms of the knowledge of language that we already discussed previously. So, here we are focusing on certain terms which are important in this regard: hierarchical, generative, recursive and limitless. All these terms are important to understand or to describe, to discuss the idea of faculty of language. So, you learnt about some kind of hierarchy when we talked about rules, though we did not elaborate them. In future classes we will be elaborating the idea of hierarchy for some other purpose. We already learnt about the idea of generative grammar, if you remember, and we said that language is generative because they are generating something, right. And recursive, there is some idea of recursion in this notion of knowledge of language, and also limitless. If you remember the examples where we talked about the creation of a very long sentence. So, we did mention that language is also limitless with its scope of expression. Briefly, we talked about language evolution in first few classes. Again we will be pointing out towards the evolution questions in relation to the faculty of language, and this is the same question we are asking now: how humans acquire language. We asked this question previously, we are asking this question again now in a more refined way, because we have more tools, we have access to some more concepts which are now known to us. So, this is the first bullet point, talks about something that we mentioned in the very first class, if you remember. So, we do not consider language as a communication system, rather we consider it as a computational system. We are coming back to this idea again, but here we are defining the idea of computational mechanism, and we are saying that there is some kind of interface between sensory motor and conceptual intentional systems. There are two different systems. So, we can ask these questions at this point. We can ask, did human language evolve gradually? If you remember the discussion of animal communication, communication of chimpanzees for example. So, now we are coming back to the idea of animal communication, but we are focusing the concept of continuity, which is new and important. So, is it the case that human language evolved gradually or it is sudden? So, was there a continuity or was it a result of discontinuity? So, let me tell you at this point that we started discussing the idea of faculty of language from the article that I had mentioned in the last class in the key reference section. The article that was published in the Science magazine by Chomsky, Hauser and Fitch. So, we will be basically dealing with the article in this class, and after attending the class you can read the article and ask if you have any specific questions to yourself. We can clarify it later, of course. So, idea of continuity is very important at this point, and we are trying to link the idea of continuity with the evolution question. So, we are coming back to animal communication and asking a very basic question. Do we have some shared properties with animal communication? Do we have unique language? The second question you already know the answer. We already discussed about this question that yes, it is unique to human beings, and that is how we came to the concept of faculty of language. We said that it is essentially human, but we are asking regarding the shared properties. So, do we have some shared properties with animal communication? So, I am helping you to go back to some examples of animal communication. You can say that bee dance, I mean when bees dance there is a complex pattern. In certain kind of bird song there are complex patterns too, and chimpanzees have complex communication pattern that we have discussed previously, and we also talked about certain experiments by psychologists. So, now at this point we can ask these questions: what does animal communication lack? We talked about the properties of human language, we also talked about some concepts which are developed in relation to the faculty of language, which is essentially human, we already mentioned. But here I am emphasizing these two ideas that I have put in quote: rich, expressive and open ended. So, animal communication lacks rich, expressive and open ended power of human language. So, I will ask you to pause here and think about these two concepts. Why we are saying rich, expressive? We will be talking about it in detail in future, and also why we are saying open ended. Open ended, it is to some extent clear to you, because if you think about the example of limitless sentences or a very long sentence that you can actually extend. So, that is related to the idea of open endedness. So, here you also need to understand that how we account for the faculty of language. Of course, we depend on data, we rely on data, empirical data, and we do take some theoretical stand. So, empirical data and theoretical propositions are important for linguists when we comment on or try to understand the nature of the faculty of language. And we already talked about the fact that language is an internal component of mind or brain. We did learn about what Chomsky said about the new definition of language, and we also talked about the fact that language is an internal component, if you remember the idea of language organ. And evolution and function of language faculty are two essential and important questions related to our learning. So, we already talked about two different types of FLs, if you remember. FLB, or faculty of language in a broad sense, it includes internal computational system, and we can say that FLN, or faculty of language in a narrow sense, combined with two other organism internal systems, sensory motor and conceptual intentional, and there are some biological capacities which are not present in animals like chimpanzees. We talked about the idea of biological capacities, right. If you remember the idea of Lenneberg that we had already discussed previously, and we also tried to link Lenneberg's ideas with Chomsky's ideas, and we came to know that language is basically considered as a biological behavior, and animals like chimpanzees do not have that particular biological capacity that we have. So, when we talk about the biological capacity, we can say that it helps us to master human language without explicit instruction. Again, we can draw from Lenneberg that direct teaching and explicit instruction has relatively little effect in the acquisition. So, FLB excludes the organism internal system that is necessary, but not sufficient for language. So, you can say that there are other systems like memory, digestion, respiration, but we are talking about language specifically, and FLN abstract linguistic computational system alone, which is independent of other systems. So, faculty of language in a narrow sense is the linguistic computational system alone. This is the important part for our purpose, and we have to understand that FLN is considered as a component of FLB. So, mechanisms of FLN can be considered as a subset of the mechanisms of FLB. So, this is very important for us to understand, because we are talking about the computational system in detail, and also try to differentiate between the ideas of faculty of language in narrow and broad sense. So, here I am quoting from the paper that we are discussing. FLN takes a finite set of elements and yields a potentially infinite array of discrete expressions. So, I am sure that you remembered these terms that I have highlighted in the next bullet point, finite set of elements, and also there is this idea of infinite and discrete. When we discussed the very new definition of language by Chomsky, initially it was very new for some of you. For some of you it was not so new, but you had an opportunity to go through it again. But we did talk about the idea of creating infinite sentences with the help of finite means. We are coming back to this idea again and again, and that is why I have quoted it again at this point. So, FLN takes a finite set of elements. Here we are actually trying to relate to the definition of language with the question of faculty of language. Faculty of language in a narrow sense takes this finite set of elements, and potential infinite array of discrete expressions are there. And also pause at this concept of discrete. We will be coming back to this idea of discreteness again while dealing with sound systems, for example. So, this is very important for us to understand that this is a major property of human language. And each expression is passed through the sensory motor and conceptual intentional systems, which process and elaborate this information for use. So, each expression is passed through this interface. This is a very new idea for some of us, and at this point we also need to keep in mind that each expression, when we are saying each expression, what do we mean? Each expression is a pair of sound and meaning. So, remember we talked about this pair of sound and meaning briefly, but we have to come back to this again and again, because this is a very central idea of modern linguistics, why we are saying that it is a pair of sound and meaning. So, I am asking you to recall a few notions which we had learned previously, because this is going to be a wrap up class, as I told you, for week 2. I hope you remembered that there is no limit to the length of a sentence, and here you can say that language is analogous to natural numbers. And there is of course this perspective of innateness that we had discussed previously. So, when we talk about the comparison between human and animal communication, I will mention 3 different hypotheses that Chomsky, Heuser and Fitch mentioned in their paper, very important paper. So, the first hypothesis is that FLB constitutes of the same functional element that underlie communication in other species. So, there is some kind of sameness, which is the first hypothesis. Hypothesis 2 says that FLB is uniquely human adaptation for language, and natural selection, I hope you remember natural selection from school biology. Natural selection played an important role in the development of FLB. Basically, we are linking it to some sort of evolution question, right. We have been talking about evolution question in today's class as well. And hypothesis 3 says that only FLN is uniquely human. Most, if not all, of FLB is based on mechanisms shared with non-humans. So, here in the hypothesis 3 you can see that there is a clear distinction, and of course, all these are hypotheses, and people have talked about this hypothesis based on certain studies that they have done in the domain of cognitive science. So, we are talking about the fact that only FLN is uniquely human. If you go back to the idea of FLN and the properties that we were discussing today, maybe it will make sense. And FLB is somehow shared with non-humans. So, we have to now we can have a very different approach towards the difference between human and non-human communication. Earlier we were talking about the examples of animal communication and discussing certain ideas like finiteness, like whether it is unconscious creation of sentences, etc. But now there is a new way to differentiate human and animal communication in terms of the faculty of language. Also, FLN has the computational mechanism of recursion, which is more recently evolved and unique to humans. Again, there is some relationship between the evolutionary perspective and the idea of the faculty of language. So, the computational mechanism of recursion is of course unique to humans, but it is more recently evolved is a important point. So, it is argued that uniquely human capacities have evolved 6 million years ago, a divergence from chimpanzee like common ancestors. So, initially it was similar, but there was a divergence, and at this point you can also link the idea of continuity theory, whether it is a continuous process or it's there is some sort of discontinuity. So, it is believed that there was a divergence from the common ancestral properties. So, I will ask you to recall Plato's problem at this point, because we are not only discussing the idea of faculty of language, but also trying to relate to our previous learnings in terms of the new definition of language, the concept of knowledge of language, the concept of universal grammar, concept of generative grammar and the innateness hypothesis. So, these are the concepts that we had learned through first 2 weeks, and here while discussing the idea of faculty of language, I am asking you to think about all the new concepts that you have learned, and then of course, you can go through the readings that we will be suggesting. So, we already talked about the fact that there is limited data for language acquisition, if you remember the Plato's problem and also the poverty of stimulus. when we acquire language, we can create a lot from little exposure. So, the underlying language is referred to as universal grammar. If you remember, we did talk about the idea of universal grammar, and language has certain constraints. So, if you think about the rules, you can say that we cannot go beyond the rules, though there are certain constraints, and we will be talking about the constraints in future as well. So, we understand from child language data and animal communication both that there are certain constraints in relation to the rules of language, and we cannot go beyond the rules. I mean, we have to follow the rules. That is a major property of human language, right. So, I will ask you to remember some points that we had previously discussed, beginning from the Plato's problem, what do we know and how do we know so much. So, language cannot be explained with the help of the behaviorist models that people used to adopt previously in pre-Chomsky era, and the behaviorist models, now you know that they try to rely on the stimulus response kind of models. We talked about the idea that our brain must have some programs that can build unlimited sentences out of finite words. So, now you know the idea of faculty of language and FLN. So, it does make sense, right, some kind of program that build unlimited sentences out of finite words. And we also talked about the fact that children can automatically develop complex grammars, no formal training is needed for that. And we can produce and understand sentences that we have never heard. So, with the help of our capacity, we can judge the ungrammaticality, and we can basically speak and understand infinite number of sentences in the languages that we know. We can also say that our mental grammar can generate unlimited sentence. It is basically saying the same thing in a slightly different way, but we are highlighting the term generate, because generation is very important. We are talking about generative grammar. We talked about the fact that human mind is complex. We also use the term notoriously complex, if you remember, and we talked about modularity, again borrowing from Chomskyan notions. So, we said that language is a module of the mind, and modularity is a major feature of human language, and we master a set of rules. You can highlight set of rules and recognize ungrammatical sentences. So, I am sure you can remember all the discussions that we previously had. This is a kind of recap for you. I hope you remember Vug test also, those imaginary creatures that were created to test plural formation among children in English. So, Vug test was a litmus test for understanding the concept of the rules of language, and I am sure you can think about more rules now in your own language or English, because by now I am assuming that you have created some examples of ungrammatical sentences, and you have also thought about the ungrammaticality in terms of the rules of your language, because in linguistics, until and unless you are having some data, some real data from some language, you will not be understanding the concept. So, that is why we asked you to begin with this very small exercise. So, we said that there are some rules like merge and move, if you remember, which basically help you to understand the structure dependence of human language, which is another property, major property of human language. And rules are part of our unconscious or tacit knowledge of language. This is something that we mentioned as well. We learn about knowledge of language from speech impairment as well. We discussed case of speech impairment and how brain damage can create loss of speech, and it can come back to one person, but the same language will come back, not any other language. This is another way of saying that that the concept of language faculty is extremely important for us. So, I will ask you to go through these readings after attending the lectures of week 2. Some of these readings are already mentioned in the key references after the lectures that you have attended previously. So, first 3 chapters from Jean Acheson's The Articulate Mammal, and also the first chapter from Fromkin, Rodman and Hyams, and these two I will ask you to read, and from these 2 books. And the third bullet point, which is the reference. Reference is basically the article that we are discussing today, or we have already discussed. So, you can check the reference section again in order to remember the name. So, in the conclusion, we will say that today we came back to this idea of animal and human communication and tried to understand the difference in a newer way. We did talk about the differences, but today we talked about the difference directly in relation to the faculty of language. We also talked about the 2 types of faculty of language, FLB and FLN, and discussed some features and hypotheses related to these 2. We raised the evolution questions related to the idea of continuity, whether language evolved as a gradual process or it was sudden. So, this is the key reading for today's class that we have been discussing since this last class. You can go through it, and as a reference you can use it, and if you have more questions you can also jot down the questions. Thank you.